anything inside me that isn't in anybody else. It's taken a lot of time, and it hasn't come overnight. You know, you have to put in the hard work and cry and for sure laugh about everything that you can.
She says sometimes you can only find the light by looking straight through the dark memories.
What it was like being in the backyard, it's always there in the back of my mind. Never really goes away.
The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet neighborhood of South Lake Tahoe, California, as 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard prepared for what she believed would be just another ordinary day. It was June 10, 1991, and the golden-haired girl with bright blue eyes had no way of knowing that the next 18 years of her life would be stolen from her in the span of just a few terrifying moments. The cheerful sounds of birds chirping and the distant hum of morning traffic created a peaceful backdrop that would soon be shattered by an act of unthinkable cruelty. Jaycee lived with her mother, Terry Probin, and stepfather, Carl Probin, in a modest home nestled among the towering pine trees that characterized the mountainous region around Lake Tahoe. Their house sat on a gentle slope, with the school bus stop positioned just up the hill from their front door. It was close enough that Terry could watch her daughter walk to catch the bus each morning, a routine that had become as natural as breathing. The family had moved to this quiet corner of California seeking the kind of safe, small-town atmosphere where children could grow up without fear, where neighbors knew each other by name, and where the most pressing concern might be whether to pack an extra sweater for the mountain weather. That particular Monday morning felt no different from countless others. Terry watched from the kitchen window as Jaycee, wearing a pink windbreaker and carrying her school backpack, began her familiar trek up the winding road toward the bus stop. The 11-year-old moved with the easy confidence of a child who had made this same journey hundreds of times before. Her blonde hair caught the early sunlight as she walked, and for a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal in their small corner of the world. But perfect normalcy can be shattered in an instant, and evil can arrive wearing the most ordinary disguise. Carl Probin was in the garage, tinkering with a bicycle, when he heard the sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a sharp, electric crackling noise, followed immediately by Jaycee's terrified scream. The sound cut through the peaceful morning air like a knife, sending every parental instinct in Carl's body into overdrive. He dropped what he was doing and rushed outside, his heart already pounding with a dread he couldn't yet name. What Carl witnessed in those next few seconds would replay in his mind like a nightmare loop for years to come. A gray sedan had pulled up beside Jaycee on the road. Two figures had emerged from the vehicle with practiced efficiency. The man, later identified as Philip Craig Garrido, was holding what appeared to be a stun gun. The woman with him was Nancy Garrido, his devoted wife and willing accomplice. Together, they had turned a quiet residential street into the scene of every parent's worst nightmare. Carl watched in horror as the electric weapon was used on his stepdaughter. Jaycee's small body convulsed as the electrical current coursed through her, her scream of pain and terror echoing off the mountainsides. Before Carl could react, before he could run to help her, before he could even fully process what he was seeing, the two strangers had grabbed the unconscious child and thrown her into their car like a piece of cargo. The stepfather ran toward the vehicle with every ounce of strength he possessed, his legs pumping against the uphill slope, his voice hoarse as he shouted for them to stop. But the gray sedan was already pulling away, its tires kicking up dust and gravel as it sped down the mountain road. Carl chased the car as far as his legs would carry him, memorizing every detail he could about the vehicle, the license plate, the direction they were heading. But it wasn't enough. In a matter of seconds, Jaycee had vanished, swallowed up by the vast network of highways that crisscrossed California. The immediate aftermath of Jaycee's disappearance was a whirlwind of police sirens, emergency responders, and the kind of organized chaos that follows a crisis. Terry Probin's world collapsed the moment Carl burst through the front door, his face white with shock, struggling to find the words to explain what had just happened. The phrase, "Jaycee's been taken," seemed impossible, like something that happened to other families in other places, not to them, not in their safe little community tucked away in the mountains. Within hours, their home had been transformed into the center of a massive search operation. Law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions descended on South Lake Tahoe, bringing with them helicopters, search dogs, and teams of investigators. The FBI was called in, recognizing immediately that this was likely a kidnapping case that would cross state and possibly international boundaries. Every available resource was mobilized in those crucial first hours when the chances of finding a missing child alive are at their highest. Terry Probin became the face of a mother's worst nightmare, appearing on television screens across the nation with Jaycee's school photograph clutched in her trembling hands. Her voice would break as she pleaded with anyone who might have information to come forward, as she begged her daughter's captors to let her go, as she promised to do anything, pay anything, sacrifice anything to bring her baby home. The image of Terry's tear-streaked face became seared into the public consciousness, a stark reminder of how quickly a normal life can be torn apart by random violence. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks stretched into months, the intense media attention began to fade. News stories claimed the headlines, and the general public moved on to other concerns. For Terry Probin, however, time stood still. She transformed her home into a command center for the search, covering every available surface with flyers bearing Jaycee's photograph and description. She worked tirelessly with organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and Child Quest International, never allowing hope to die even as the official search efforts gradually scaled back. Terry Probin worked closely with the authorities, the media, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Child Quest International, and her friends in the search. She turned her house into a center where posters were folded and mailed. She conducted interviews with anyone who would listen, maintaining an exhausting schedule of public appearances and media interviews in the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, had seen something that could lead to Jaycee's return. The strain of Jaycee's disappearance took an enormous toll on the family. Terry and Carl Probin separated almost 4 years after Jaycee Lee Dugard vanished, and he has since claimed that one of the reasons for it was that Terry could never forgive him for not being able to save her little daughter. The guilt that Carl carried was overwhelming. He replayed those crucial seconds over and over in his mind, wondering if he could have run faster, reacted quicker, done something different that might have changed the outcome. The what-ifs tormented him, creating a chasm between him and Terry that eventually became unbridgeable. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to the desperate family and the army of searchers, Jaycee was being held captive less than 200 miles away in Antioch, California, in the backyard compound of the very people who had stolen her from the street that June morning. Philip Craig Garrido was a predator who had been hiding in plain sight, a registered sex offender whose previous crimes should have marked him as an ongoing danger to the community. Garrido's criminal history was a catalog of escalating violence and sexual assault that should have kept him locked away from society permanently. In 1972, he had been arrested for the kidnapping and rape of a young woman, a crime that earned him a federal sentence that should have kept him in prison for decades. But the justice system failed spectacularly, releasing him after only 11 years of what was supposed to be a much longer sentence. Upon his release, he was placed under federal parole supervision, a system that was supposed to monitor his activities and ensure public safety. The failure of the parole system to adequately supervise Garrido would prove to be one of the most catastrophic breakdowns in criminal justice oversight in modern American history. Despite a history of rapes and abductions, the report argues, the system repeatedly underplayed Philip Garrido's danger and gave his parole agents the impression that the twice-convicted kidnapper and rapist had genuinely reformed himself. This dangerous miscalculation would have devastating consequences for Jaycee and her family. Nancy Garrido, Philip's wife, was far from an innocent bystander in the nightmare that was about to unfold. She had met Philip while he was in prison and had chosen to marry him despite knowing the full extent of his criminal history. Some would later argue that Nancy was herself a victim, manipulated and controlled by her husband's psychological dominance. Others would see her as an active participant in the crimes, someone who made conscious choices to facilitate and participate in unspeakable acts against a child. The evidence suggests that Nancy was far more than a passive observer. Disturbing new video released Tuesday shows the wife of convicted kidnapper and rapist Philip Garrido luring a young girl into the couple's van, asking her to do the splits and videotaping her 2 years after the couple kidnapped 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard. This footage, discovered years later, revealed that Nancy was not only aware of her husband's predatory behavior but was actively assisting in targeting other potential victims. When Jaycee regained consciousness after being stunned and kidnapped, she found herself in a nightmare that defied comprehension. She was imprisoned in a series of ramshackle structures hidden in the backyard of the Garrido property, a compound that had been specifically designed to hold her captive. The buildings were concealed from view by tarps, sheets of metal, and makeshift walls that created a hidden world within what appeared to be an ordinary suburban backyard. The conditions of Jaycee's captivity were deliberately designed to break her spirit and make her completely dependent on her captors. Her kidnapper and his wife, Nancy, keep her chained up naked in a backyard shed. Philip repeatedly rapes her, often for days on end when he is high on meth. She is completely alone, and he makes her dependent on him for everything. Even though she hates him, she also wants his approval. This psychological manipulation was as devastating as the physical abuse, creating a complex web of fear, dependency, and survival mechanisms that would take years to untangle. Garrido was a master manipulator who understood exactly how to control his victim. He isolated Jaycee completely from the outside world, telling her repeatedly that her family had stopped looking for her, that they had forgotten about her, that she was now part of his family, and that this was her new reality. The Garridos manipulated her into believing her family had forgotten her, which led her to develop a sense of dependence on her captors. For a child who had been suddenly ripped away from everything familiar and safe, these lies became a devastating psychological weapon. The compound where Jaycee was held was a maze of improvised structures that had been built over time to serve Garrido's twisted purposes. She had been kidnapped by Philip Garrido, a convicted sex offender, and his wife, Nancy, and held captive in a series of tense and dilapidated sheds in their Antioch, California backyard. These structures were hidden from the view of neighbors and law enforcement by clever positioning and camouflage, creating what was essentially a prison camp in plain sight. As the months and years passed, Jaycee's captivity took on the horrific routine of systematic abuse and psychological conditioning. Philip Garrido was a methamphetamine addict whose drug use made his behavior even more erratic and dangerous. During his drug-fueled binges, the violence and sexual assault would escalate to levels that tested the very limits of human endurance. Jaycee learned to survive by disappearing into herself, by creating mental escapes that allowed her consciousness to flee from the unbearable reality of what was happening to her body. The isolation was perhaps as damaging as the physical abuse. Jaycee spent months at a time without seeing another human being besides her captors. She had no access to television, radio, newspapers, or any connection to the outside world. She didn't know if her family was still looking for her, if she had been declared dead, or if the entire world had simply moved on without her. This complete severing of human connection is a form of psychological torture that can break even the strongest spirit. When Jaycee was 14 years old, 3 years into her captivity, she became pregnant as a result of the repeated sexual assaults. For a child who was still dealing with the trauma of her own kidnapping and abuse, the prospect of bringing another life into this nightmare world was overwhelming. She gave birth to her first daughter, Angel, in 1994, with only Nancy Garrido acting as midwife. There was no doctor, no hospital, no medical care of any kind. The birth took place in the same makeshift structures where Jaycee was being held prisoner. The arrival of Angel created a complex new dynamic in Jaycee's captivity. On one hand, having a child to care for gave her a new reason to survive, a purpose that helped her endure the ongoing abuse. On the other hand, it also meant that she could never attempt to escape or resist too forcefully, because doing so might put her daughter in danger. Garrido understood this psychological leverage perfectly and used it to ensure Jaycee's continued compliance. 2 years later, in 1997, Jaycee gave birth to her second daughter, Starlet. Now she was responsible for 2 young lives in addition to her own survival. The girls became both her greatest joy and her heaviest burden. She loved them with a fierce maternal instinct, but she also lived in constant fear of what their captivity was doing to their developing minds and spirits. Raising children in captivity presented challenges that no parent should ever have to face. Jaycee had to find ways to educate her daughters, to provide them with some sense of normalcy and security, all while living under the constant threat of violence and abuse. She became their teacher, their protector, their entire world, while simultaneously being a victim herself. The psychological strength required to maintain hope and sanity under these circumstances is almost impossible to imagine. The girls grew up believing that Philip and Nancy were their grandparents and that Jaycee was their older sister. This false narrative was carefully constructed by Garrido to prevent the children from asking difficult questions about their living situation or attempting to contact the outside world. Angel and Starlet had no understanding that they were living in captivity, that their sister was actually their mother, or that the world beyond their hidden compound even existed. Throughout the years of captivity, there were numerous opportunities for law enforcement to discover Jaycee and her daughters, but the parole system's failures were consistent and devastating. Garrido remained under federal supervision until 1999 when California took over keeping tabs on him. He had no parole violations, federal authorities told the Santa Fe New Mexican in 2009. This clean record was maintained through careful deception and the complete failure of parole officers to conduct thorough inspections of the property. Parole officers visited the Garrido property periodically, but their inspections were superficial and failed to uncover the hidden compound where Jaycee and her daughters were being held. The officers focused on the main house and were apparently satisfied with Garrido's explanations about the various structures in the backyard. They never discovered the carefully concealed areas where 3 human beings were living in captivity just yards away from where the official inspections were taking place. In 1993, there was a particularly egregious missed opportunity when Philip Garrido was locked up in federal custody for an unspecified parole violation for 38 days. This was a time, it could be argued, when Nancy could have freed Dugard, but instead she continued to keep her captive. During this period, Nancy Garrido had complete control over Jaycee and could have released her at any time. Instead, she chose to maintain the captivity, proving her active participation in the ongoing crimes. The psychological impact of 18 years of captivity on Jaycee was profound and complex. She developed what psychologists would later recognize as a severe case of Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological phenomenon where hostages develop positive feelings toward their captors as a survival mechanism. Even though she hates him, she also wants his approval. This internal conflict between hatred and dependency created a psychological maze that would take years of therapy to navigate. Jaycee also had to develop incredible mental resilience to maintain her sanity during the long years of imprisonment. She created elaborate fantasy worlds in her mind, places where she could escape when the physical reality became unbearable. She held on to memories of her mother and her life before the kidnapping, using these precious recollections as anchors to her true identity when everything else seemed lost. The compound where they lived was a study in controlled chaos. Garrido was paranoid about discovery and had rigged the property with various security measures designed to alert him if anyone approached the hidden areas. He also filled the space with his delusional religious and philosophical writings, creating a bizarre environment where criminal behavior was justified through twisted interpretations of spirituality and personal revelation. As the years passed, Garrido's behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous. His methamphetamine addiction worsened, leading to periods of extreme violence and unpredictability. During these episodes, Jaycee learned to make herself as invisible as possible, protecting her daughters while enduring whatever abuse came her way. The survival skills she developed during this time were remarkable in their sophistication and heartbreaking in their necessity. The outside world, meanwhile, had not forgotten about Jaycee Dugard. Her photograph appeared on milk cartons, missing person websites, and age progression posters that showed what she might look like as she grew older. Terry Probin never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that her daughter was alive somewhere and would eventually come home. This unwavering faith would prove to be prophetic, though the reunion would come in a way that no one could have predicted. By 2009, 18 years after her kidnapping, Jaycee had reached the age of 29. She was no longer the 11-year-old girl who had disappeared on that June morning in 1991. She was now a woman who had survived unimaginable trauma, raised 2 children under impossible circumstances, and somehow maintained enough of her core identity to remember who she had been before the nightmare began. The beginning of the end of Jaycee's captivity came from an unexpected source. Philip Garrido's increasing instability and grandiose delusions led him to make decisions that would ultimately expose his crimes. He had developed a messianic complex and believed that he had important religious messages to share with the world. This narcissistic need for recognition and validation would prove to be his downfall. In August 2009, Garrido decided to visit the University of California, Berkeley campus to distribute religious literature and share his twisted philosophical insights with students and faculty. This wasn't unusual behavior for him. He had been making similar excursions for some time as part of his delusional belief that he was meant to be a spiritual leader. What was different this time was that he brought Jaycee and her daughters with him. The 4 of them made an odd group on the university campus. Garrido was carrying religious pamphlets and trying to engage students in conversation about his beliefs. The 2 girls, now 15 and 12 years old, were clearly uncomfortable and out of place in the academic environment. Jaycee stayed close to them, her protective instincts in full display as she tried to shield her daughters from the curious stares of passers-by. Several people on campus noticed the strange group and were concerned about the welfare of the 2 young girls. There was something about their behavior, their appearance, and their obvious discomfort that raised red flags for observant bystanders. Some of these concerned individuals contacted campus security, reporting their suspicions about what they had witnessed. Campus security officers approached Garrido and questioned him about his activities and the identity of his companions. His explanations were rambling and inconsistent, full of religious rhetoric that didn't adequately address their concerns about the children. The officers decided that the situation warranted further investigation and contacted Garrido's parole officer to report the incident. This contact with campus security would prove to be the crack in the facade that Garrido had maintained for 18 years. Officer Ally Jacobs discovered, through a background check, that Garrido was a registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape. When he and the girls returned for their appointment at 2 p.m. the following day, August 25th, Jacobs made a point of sitting in during the meeting. The parole officer, Ally Jacobs, was more thorough in her questioning than previous officials had been. She was immediately suspicious of Garrido's explanations about the two young girls who were with him. His story that they were the daughters of a relative didn't ring true, and his nervous, evasive behavior suggested that he was hiding something significant. Jacobs decided to separate Garrido from the girls and question them individually. When Jacobs spoke with Jaycee privately, the carefully constructed lies that had held the captivity together for 18 years began to crumble. Jaycee, who had been known to her daughters and the outside world by the name Alyssa, was emotionally and psychologically unprepared for direct questioning by a law enforcement officer. The years of isolation and manipulation had not equipped her for this moment of potential liberation. The conversation was hesitant and filled with long pauses as Jaycee struggled with conflicting emotions and loyalties. Part of her desperately wanted to reveal the truth and end the nightmare, while another part feared the consequences of defying her captors. She had been conditioned for so long to believe that disclosure would result in terrible punishment, not just for herself but for her daughters as well. Gradually, through patient and skillful questioning, Jacobs began to piece together the incredible truth. The woman who called herself Alyssa was actually Jaycee Dugard, the 11-year-old girl who had disappeared from South Lake Tahoe 18 years earlier. The two girls were her daughters, born during her captivity. The entire family structure that Garrido had presented was an elaborate fiction designed to conceal one of the most shocking kidnapping cases in American history. The moment of revelation was overwhelming for everyone involved. For Jaycee, it meant the end of a survival strategy that had kept her and her daughters alive for nearly 2 decades. For Jacobs, it meant the solution to a cold case that had haunted law enforcement for years. For the Garridos, it meant that their carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation was about to collapse around them. Garrido and his wife were placed under arrest. An FBI special agent put Dugard on the telephone with her mother, Terry Probin. Dugard retained custody of her children and reunited with her mother on August 27, 2009. The phone call between Jaycee and her mother was a moment of pure emotion that defied description. Terry Probin had waited 18 years to hear her daughter's voice again, and when that moment finally came, the power of their connection transcended all the pain and separation they had endured. It was at the hotel later that day that Dugard saw her mother, Terry Probin, for the first time since the Garridos had shocked her with a stun gun and drove her away in their car. Probin had rushed to Concord from Southern California after getting the news she had been hoping to get for nearly 2 decades. The reunion between mother and daughter was both joyful and heartbreaking, a mixture of overwhelming relief and the sobering realization of how much time had been stolen from them. The immediate aftermath of Jaycee's discovery was a media sensation that rivaled any news story of the decade. The case had everything that captured public attention: a long-missing child, a dramatic rescue, evil perpetrators, and a family reunion that seemed impossible. Television networks interrupted regular programming to report the breaking news, and within hours, the story was being covered by media outlets around the world. For Jaycee and her daughters, this sudden exposure was another form of trauma. They had lived in complete isolation for so long that the attention of the global media was overwhelming and frightening. Jaycee had to navigate not only her own emotional needs but also the psychological welfare of 2 teenagers who were learning for the first time that their entire understanding of reality had been built on lies. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and emotionally charged. Philip and Nancy Garrido were charged with multiple felonies, including kidnapping, rape, and false imprisonment. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including Jaycee's testimony, physical evidence from the compound, and the Garridos' own admissions of guilt. Both defendants ultimately accepted plea agreements that sentenced them to lengthy prison terms, ensuring that they would never again have the opportunity to harm another victim. As Garrido had been on parole for a 1976 rape at the time of her kidnapping, Dugard sued the state of California, which had taken over his parole supervision from the federal government in 1999, on account of the numerous lapses by law enforcement that contributed to her continued captivity. The civil litigation highlighted the systematic failures that had allowed the kidnapping to occur and the captivity to continue for so long. In 2010, the state of California awarded the Dugard family $20 million in recognition of the government's failure to protect Jaycee and prevent her ongoing victimization. The process of healing and rebuilding their lives would prove to be a long and difficult journey for Jaycee and her daughters. They had to learn how to function in a world that was completely foreign to them, how to form relationships with people outside their immediate family, and how to process 18 years of trauma while simultaneously trying to create a normal future. Jaycee showed remarkable courage in deciding to tell her story publicly. A Stolen Life, a memoir, is a true crime book by American kidnapping victim Jaycee Lee Dugard about the 18 years she spent while sequestered and enslaved with her captors in Antioch, California. The memoir dissects what she did to survive and cope mentally with extreme abuse. The book reached #1 on Amazon sales rankings a day before release and topped the New York Times bestseller list hardcover nonfiction for 6 weeks after release. Through her memoir and subsequent public appearances, Jaycee became an advocate for missing children and their families. She used her platform to raise awareness about the long-term impacts of kidnapping and captivity, the importance of never giving up hope, and the need for better systems to protect vulnerable children. Her voice became a powerful force for change in law enforcement procedures and victim support services. The story of Jaycee Dugard is ultimately one of incredible human resilience and the unbreakable bonds of family love. Despite 18 years of unimaginable trauma, she managed to maintain her core identity, protect and nurture her children, and find the strength to rebuild her life when freedom finally came. Her mother's unwavering faith and tireless search efforts proved that some kinds of love truly can conquer any obstacle. The case also serves as a stark reminder of the failures in our criminal justice system and the devastating consequences when those failures allow predators to remain free in our communities. The multiple missed opportunities to discover Jaycee's captivity highlight the need for better training, more thorough supervision, and increased accountability in parole and probation systems. Today, Jaycee continues to work on healing and building a future for herself and her daughters. She has chosen to live a relatively private life, focusing on her family and her advocacy work rather than seeking continued public attention. Her story remains one of the most compelling examples of human survival and the power of hope to sustain us through even the darkest circumstances. The 11-year-old girl who disappeared on that June morning in 1991 may have been stolen away from her childhood and her family, but she was never truly lost. Through 18 years of captivity, she held onto the essential parts of herself that made her who she was. When freedom finally came, she was ready to reclaim her life and build something new from the ashes of what had been taken from her. The legacy of Jaycee Dugard's story extends far beyond the individual tragedy and triumph it represents. It has changed laws, improved procedures, and given hope to thousands of families who are still searching for their own missing loved ones. Most importantly, it stands as a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit and the truth that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone.